The sun was shining brightly that Saturday morning. The small town's shooting range buzzed with energy as local shooters gathered for their weekend practice. It was a friendly but competitive atmosphere, filled with people showing off their new rifles, fancy gear, and expensive scopes. Laughter and loud conversations mixed with the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing across the open field. Amid all the noise and excitement, a quiet figure appeared at the gate. She was a woman in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, dressed in a simple checkered shirt, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers. Her brown hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she carried a small black bag slung over her shoulder. Unlike the others, she didn't arrive in a big truck or wear protective glasses hanging from her neck. She looked ordinary. Her name was Sarah Collins. She wasn't known around this shooting range. No one had seen her before, and she didn't carry herself like the regulars did. There was something modest, almost shy, about her. When she reached the registration table, she gave a polite smile to the clerk, paid her small fee, and quietly walked toward the far end of the range. Some of the regular shooters noticed her right away. They were a loud group, mostly men in tactical vests, boasting about how many medals they had won. One of them nudged his friend and said, "Looks like we've got a newbie today." Another laughed and added, "Probably watched a YouTube video and thought she could shoot." Their laughter was sharp and unkind, but Sarah didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't care. She set her small bag on the wooden bench and began unpacking her things. Inside was an old rifle, clearly well used but carefully maintained. The metal had lost some of its shine, and the wooden stock had scratches that told stories of many years of use. It wasn't the kind of modern, flashy weapon the others had. It was simple, like her. Sarah moved slowly but confidently. She checked the chamber, adjusted the sights, and laid out her small box of ammunition. Every movement was calm and practiced, showing a quiet familiarity with what she was doing. Still, the others only saw a plain woman with an outdated gun. The sound of her boots crunching against the gravel was the only thing that seemed to interrupt the laughter and chatter nearby. A few curious eyes followed her, whispering comments as she prepared her lane. "She doesn't even have proper gloves," one said. "Bet she won't hit the target," another joked. But Sarah remained focused. Her eyes, calm and observant, scanned the target's downrange. The bright circles at the end of the field glimmered in the sun, taunting every shooter with their stillness. She took a deep breath, as if taking in the entire atmosphere around her, the smell of gunpowder, the cool wind brushing her face, and the distant calls of birds from the nearby trees. There was something about her presence that felt different. Even though she didn't say a word, there was an air of quiet strength in how she carried herself. It wasn't pride or arrogance, it was composure. She didn't need to impress anyone. She was there for her own reason. As she stood there adjusting her stance, a group of shooters nearby began to watch more openly. One of them, a tall man with dark sunglasses, smirked and called out, "Hey lady, you sure you're in the right place? The pottery class is down the street." Laughter erupted among his friends. Sarah glanced at them briefly, her expression unreadable, then simply turned back to her setup. Her silence seemed to confuse them. They expected her to react, maybe defend herself, but she didn't. She just quietly loaded a single bullet into her rifle and continued checking her sights. The men exchanged glances, their smirks fading into something more uncertain. Meanwhile, others around the range noticed the interaction. Some rolled their eyes at the rude group, others simply watched in curiosity. The newcomer's calmness was unexpected. There was something quietly dignified about her, even as she stood alone being laughed at by people who thought they knew everything. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of gunfire grew louder again. The regular shooters continued showing off, hitting near bullseyes and cheering for each other. But every now and then, someone's gaze would drift toward the quiet woman at the end of the line, still preparing, still focused, still unbothered. To anyone paying close attention, it was clear that Sarah wasn't nervous. She wasn't fumbling or uncertain. Every action she took had purpose. Her hands moved smoothly, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. There was a story behind her calmness. something no one there yet knew. When she finally looked downrange again, her eyes narrowed, slightly. Her breathing evened out and a faint smile touched her lips. It was the kind of expression that said, "I've been here before." The crowd didn't realize it yet, but something extraordinary was about to happen. In a place full of noise, ego, and arrogance, one quiet stranger was about to change everything, not with words, but with one single, unforgettable shot. And at that moment, as the warm breeze brushed past her face and the distant laughter faded into the background, Sarah's calm determination stood out like a whisper of power in a world of noise. The stage was set. The mockery had begun. But soon the mockers would fall silent, completely unaware that the simple woman they ridiculed was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The group of shooters at the far end of the range was well known. They came every weekend wearing fancy ear protectors, sunglasses, and matching shooting gloves. Their names were whispered around the range: Mark, Ryan, and Lance, the so-called kings of precision. They were good, no doubt, but they were also loud, proud, and painfully arrogant. They treated the range like their own kingdom, walking around with a sense of ownership that made newcomers uncomfortable. Whenever someone new arrived, they would size them up from head to toe, looking for something to laugh at. It was their favorite hobby, mocking beginners, showing off their gear, and proving they were the best. That morning, when Sarah Collins quietly walked in, they noticed her immediately. Mark, the tallest of the group, leaned against the counter, chewing gum with an overconfident smirk. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, nodding toward her. "Grandma's here to shoot some bottles." His friends burst out laughing. Ryan, the youngest and most sarcastic of the three, added, "Man, she's carrying that old rifle like it's an antique from a museum. Maybe she's here for memories, not targets." The others laughed even louder, clearly enjoying their own jokes. But Sarah didn't even glance at them. She was focused on her setup, checking the sights, adjusting her position, and quietly minding her business. Her calmness irritated them. Bullies always hated it when their words didn't work. Lance, who loved attention, decided to make things more entertaining. "Hey, ma'am," he called out across the lanes. "Need help holding that rifle? It looks heavy." The men chuckled, exchanging high fives like teenage boys. A few bystanders shook their heads in disapproval, but no one said anything. Everyone knew the kings ruled the range. Sarah turned slightly toward them. Her eyes met Lance's for a brief moment. Not angry, not defensive, just calm. "No, thank you," she said softly. "I can handle it." Her tone was polite but firm, and it caught them off guard. There was something about the way she spoke. Not fearful, not irritated, just quietly confident. For a second, the group fell silent. But Mark quickly broke the pause with a loud laugh. "You can handle it. Sure, we'll see about that," he said, loading his rifle. "Let's give her a little show, boys." The three men moved to their lanes. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat as they prepared their shots. They had all the fancy equipment: laser scopes, custom grips, perfectly balanced weapons. To them, shooting was not just a hobby, it was a way to show off power. Mark took aim first. His rifle cracked through the air, and the bullet punched close to the bullseye. He turned, grinning widely. "Perfect shot," he said, loud enough for Sarah to hear. Ryan followed, firing 2 shots in quick succession, both near the center. "See that?" he said proudly. "That's how it's done." Sarah continued to prepare her rifle in silence, unbothered by their performance. She didn't rush. She checked her sight again, adjusted her grip, and stood quietly, her focus unshaken. Lance fired last, hitting just slightly off-center. He groaned, then quickly added, "Guess I was distracted by the competition." The others laughed again, but their jokes were starting to sound forced. Something about Sarah's stillness was unnerving. She didn't try to prove anything. She didn't talk back. And yet, there was a strange energy around her, calm but powerful, like a storm before it breaks. After a few more rounds of showing off, Mark leaned on his rifle and said, "All right, Grandma, let's see what you got. You've been polishing that thing long enough." His tone was half mocking, half challenging. Sarah didn't reply. She simply nodded, placed a single bullet into her rifle and took her position. Her posture changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed and her eyes locked onto the target with quiet intensity. For the first time that morning, the group's laughter faded. Something about the way she stood, so still, so precise, caught their attention. Even the instructor at the range turned his head. Ryan muttered under his breath, "What's she doing?" Mark smirked but didn't answer. A feeling of curiosity, mixed with slight discomfort, began creeping in. The woman they thought was a joke suddenly didn't seem so funny anymore. Her stillness was different. Her focus was sharp, too sharp for a beginner. Sarah lifted her rifle slowly, positioning it against her shoulder. The sunlight reflected off the metal, and a cool breeze swept across the range. The moment felt suspended in time. Everyone watched, waiting for her to miss, waiting for the laugh that would follow. But deep down, none of them realized they were witnessing the calm before the most shocking moment of the day. In a place full of ego, laughter, and noise, a simple woman was about to turn their pride into silence, not with anger or words, but with the echo of a single shot that would change the entire mood of the range. And as she steadied her breath and her finger brushed the trigger, something in her eyes revealed what no one there could have imagined. This was not her first time holding a rifle. The laughter grew louder as the woman they had been teasing, Sarah Collins, finally stepped into her lane. The group of arrogant shooters couldn't help themselves. They whispered, pointed, and grinned like schoolboys waiting for someone to make a fool of themselves. Mark, the self-proclaimed leader of the trio, leaned against his bench with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. "Hey, make sure you're aiming at the target, not the sky," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried through the range, earning a few chuckles from others nearby. Sarah didn't look at him. She just continued checking her rifle. The old weapon gleamed faintly in the sunlight, its polished wood glowing with years of careful care. Her hands moved gently, almost lovingly, as she adjusted the sights. Her calmness annoyed Mark even more. Ryan, the youngest of the three, leaned toward Lance and muttered, "She's so slow. I bet she won't even hit the board." Lance laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe she's scared." "Can't blame her. These are real shooters here." Their words floated across the range like little sparks of cruelty meant to humiliate and draw laughter. But instead of flaring up, those sparks landed on someone who didn't burn easily. Sarah's stillness was stronger than their noise. She looked peaceful, like someone who had faced much worse in life and learned not to let the world shake her. Mark grew restless. He didn't like being ignored. "You sure you loaded that thing right?" he shouted. "Wouldn't want it to blow up on you." The group burst out laughing again. Their laughter was sharp and hollow, echoing between the steel targets and wooden posts. Sarah paused for a moment, her fingers resting on the rifle. She took a quiet breath, lifted her head, and looked straight down range. She didn't glance at them, didn't roll her eyes, didn't react at all. But there was something in the way her shoulders straightened. Something powerful. Her silence was louder than their insults. For a few seconds, the noise faded. Some of the other shooters, who had been pretending not to listen, now turned their attention fully to her. They were curious. Who was this woman who could face mockery with such calm grace? The instructor, an older man named Tom, watched quietly from the side. He had been at this range for years. He'd seen soldiers, police officers, hunters, and weekend hobbyists come and go. But there was something about this woman's composure that reminded him of a certain kind of shooter, the kind who didn't need to prove anything. Meanwhile, Mark decided to push things further. He grabbed his rifle, aimed quickly at his target, and fired 3 clean shots, all landing near the bullseye. He turned and raised his arms dramatically as if performing on stage. "See that?" he shouted. "That's what real shooting looks like. Try not to embarrass yourself, sweetheart." Lance and Ryan clapped mockingly, pretending to cheer. The arrogance in their voices was thick enough to taste. A few people in the crowd laughed nervously, unsure whether to join in or stay silent. Sarah didn't react. She just placed 1 bullet into her rifle with steady hands, clicked it into place, and stood upright. The range suddenly felt quieter. Even the wind seemed to pause. For the first time, Ryan's grin faded a little. She's really not saying anything," he whispered to Lance. "Maybe she's nervous?" Lance shrugged, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Something about her calmness didn't feel like nervousness. It felt like control. Sarah lifted the rifle and rested it against her shoulder. Her movements were slow, precise, graceful, like someone dancing to a rhythm only she could hear. Her breathing slowed, her eyes focused on the target far away, and her finger rested lightly on the trigger. Mark rolled his eyes and muttered, "Come on already." But his voice had lost some of its confidence. The silence stretched. The others at the range stopped shooting, drawn to the moment without realizing why. Sarah's stillness commanded attention. There was something magnetic about her, the kind of presence that makes the world slow down for a heartbeat. The air at the shooting range felt different after that single shot. It was as if time had stopped for a few seconds. Everyone had heard the loud bang. Everyone had seen the target, and everyone was thinking the same thing. That woman just hit a perfect bullseye. The group of snobby shooters stood frozen. Their confident grins had vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Mark still held his rifle, but his hands had gone slightly shaky. Ryan blinked at the target as if he couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. Lance's jaw hung open. The laughter that once filled the air was gone, replaced by the sound of the wind and the faint hum of the range fans. But Sarah didn't seem to notice any of it. She was calm, completely calm. She moved like she had done this 1,000 times before. She didn't rush to celebrate or even look at the others. She just reloaded her rifle slowly, her expression steady and thoughtful. Tom, the old instructor, watched her with quiet admiration. He could see it clearly. Her breathing, her posture, her rhythm. Everything about her showed control. She wasn't just shooting a gun. She was mastering herself. Meanwhile, Mark tried to laugh it off. "Huh, lucky shot," he said, forcing a smirk. "Anyone can get one bullseye. Let's see her do it again." His voice wavered slightly, betraying his unease. Sarah heard him but didn't respond. She simply stepped forward again, adjusted her stance, and took aim. The world around her seemed to fade away. The noise, the whispers, the eyes watching her, none of it mattered. There was only her, the rifle, and the target. Her breathing slowed, in, out, in, out. She squeezed the trigger. Bang, another shot echoed across the range. The bullet flew straight, cutting through the air with perfect precision. When the dust settled, everyone gasped. Another bullseye, 2 perfect shots in a row. Mark's forced smirk disappeared completely. Ryan let out a quiet, nervous laugh. Okay, that's something," he muttered. Lance shook his head, his pride shrinking faster than his words could cover it. Sarah calmly lowered her rifle again, ejected the shell, and placed it neatly beside the first one on the table. She didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She just nodded slightly to herself as if checking off a small goal in her mind. To her, this wasn't about beating anyone. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about focus, pure focus. But to the men watching her, it was something else entirely. It was humiliation. They had spent years showing off at this range, building reputations based on confidence and charm. Now, in a matter of seconds, a quiet woman with an old rifle had shattered all of it, without even trying. Tom finally stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "That's not luck," he said to no one in particular. "That's training," Ryan frowned. "Training? You mean she's, what, a pro?" Tom didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on Sarah, who was now calmly reloading again. "That kind of control," he said quietly, "doesn't come from hobby shooting. That comes from years of discipline, maybe military, maybe competition. Either way, that's real skill." In that breathless moment, Sarah gently squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot cut through the air like lightning, sharp, clear, and powerful. The recoil pushed her shoulder slightly, but she didn't flinch. Smoke curled from the barrel, and for a second no one spoke. Mark blinked, squinting downrange. Then his jaw dropped. The bullet had hit dead center. A perfect bullseye. The laughter died instantly. The air itself seemed to freeze. Even the echo of the shot hung in the air a moment longer, as if refusing to fade. Sarah lowered her rifle slowly and calmly placed it back on the bench. She didn't smile, didn't boast. She just took a small step back and began cleaning her gun, as if nothing special had happened. Mark, Ryan, and Lance stared in disbelief. Their mocking grins had vanished, replaced by stunned silence. The woman they had ridiculed had just done something none of them had managed all morning. A flawless, Single-shot bullseye, and she had done it without saying a single word. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone whispered, "Who is she?" Tom, the instructor, just smiled faintly. He knew that kind of shot. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was experience, the kind earned from years of discipline, patience, and maybe even battle. Sarah simply picked up her bullet casing, slipped it into her pocket, and began packing her things. The group of snobby shooters remained frozen in place, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that silence can speak louder than laughter, and that moment, that single shot, had silenced everyone. Mark clenched his jaw. "Yeah? We'll see." His pride was bruised and he couldn't stand it. He quickly lifted his rifle, took aim, and fired. Bang! His bullet hit close to the bullseye, but not quite. Just a little off to the right. He muttered something under his breath, then fired again. Bang! This one landed further out. The harder he tried, the worse he got. The more Mark fired, the calmer Sarah became. She didn't need to compete. She had already won something bigger. The respect of everyone watching. Even those who didn't know her name felt it. The quiet power of someone who didn't need to speak to be heard. When Sarah finally set her rifle down, she looked peaceful, almost serene. The kind of peace that comes from knowing who you are no matter what the world says. The men around her began whispering. "Who is she?" someone asked. "She's amazing," another said. Even the snobby group couldn't find their laughter anymore. They just stood there staring at her like they had seen something unreal. Tom walked closer and smiled gently. "You've still got it," he said softly. Sarah looked up, a bit surprised. "Still got what?" she asked. Tom chuckled. "That calm. That focus. I've seen it before, in professionals. You don't lose that with time." She smiled politely but didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her shell casings, cleaned her rifle carefully, and placed it back in its worn case. Her movements were slow, precise, almost graceful. She didn't seem to care that she had just silenced a group of loudmouths, because that was never her goal. But everyone watching understood something in that moment. Real confidence doesn't shout. It doesn't boast. It simply shows up, stays calm under pressure, and lets the truth speak for itself. As Sarah walked past the group of stunned shooters, Mark stepped aside quietly. For once he didn't have anything to say, and as she reached the gate of the range, the sun caught the edge of her old rifle, making it glimmer faintly, a quiet reminder that even the simplest things can hold incredible power in the right hands. The tension at the shooting range hung thick in the air. Everyone could feel it. The shift from laughter to silence, from arrogance to unease. The group of snobby shooters who had arrived so full of pride were suddenly restless. Their loud voices were gone. Even their confident postures had started to fade. Sarah Collins, the quiet woman they had mocked, stood calm and steady, cleaning her old rifle with slow, practiced hands. Her two perfect bullseyes still shone brightly on the distant target board, like tiny points of truth that no one could ignore. Mark cleared his throat loudly, trying to break the awkward silence. "All right," he said, forcing a grin. "Let's make this interesting. My turn." He picked up his rifle, a modern, sleek, and expensive weapon with a long barrel and a high-tech scope. The kind of gun that looked like it belonged in a professional competition. He loaded it quickly, pretending not to care about what had just happened. "Let's see if the kings of the range still have their crowns," he said, mostly to his friends, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Ryan and Lance nodded, relieved that Mark was taking control again. They needed to regain their pride, to prove to themselves that they were still the best. Mark aimed carefully. His hands were steady, but his heart wasn't. Deep down, something about Sarah's calmness had unsettled him. He could still see her in his mind, standing silently, breathing evenly, hitting that perfect shot like it was the easiest thing in the world. He took a breath, focused on the bullseye, and fired. Bang! The shot hit near the center but slightly off. A good shot, but not perfect. Mark forced a smile. "Close enough," he said, pretending to be satisfied. Ryan went next. He cracked his neck, lifted his own rifle, and fired twice in quick bursts. Bang! Bang! Both bullets hit decently close to the middle, but again, not perfect. He lowered his weapon and muttered, Not bad." But the pride in his voice was gone. Then came Lance. He was known as the most confident of the three, always smiling, always teasing others. But even he looked unsure now. His fingers fumbled slightly as he loaded his weapon. He fired, bang, the bullet hit far off the bullseye, almost grazing the outer ring. A few people in the back winced. Lance forced a laugh, scratching the back of his head. Guess the wind caught it, he joked weakly. But there was no wind. Everyone knew it. Sarah quietly watched from her lane, saying nothing. Her expression was neutral, her eyes calm. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't smug either. It was as if she wasn't even paying attention to their results. She was just letting them be. Tom, the instructor, folded his arms, observing everything silently. He'd seen this scene before, pride breaking under quiet truth. It was almost poetic. Mark turned toward Sarah again, trying to sound confident. You see that? That's called consistency, he said, but his tone betrayed a hint of desperation. You hit 1 or 2 good shots, doesn't mean you're better than us. Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she walked up to her lane again, her steps soft but sure. She lifted her rifle, aimed, and took her time. The world seemed to hold its breath again. Bang! The shot echoed. When the dust cleared, the bullet had hit dead center again. The range went completely silent. Even the birds in the trees seemed to pause. 3 shots. 3 perfect bullseyes. Mark's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Ryan stared at the target, then at Sarah, his disbelief written all over his face. Lance simply lowered his gaze, his earlier confidence gone completely. Sarah slowly lowered her rifle, the smoke drifting softly from its barrel. She placed it back on the bench, checked her sight again, and then turned toward the targets, just a small, quiet glance. That was all it took to send a message louder than any words could. Control beats pride. Tom stepped forward, smiling faintly. That, he said in his deep, calm voice, is what discipline looks like. Ryan turned toward him. Who is she? He asked again, this time softly, almost respectfully. Tom hesitated for a moment, his eyes still on Sarah. Someone who doesn't shoot to impress, he said. She shoots because she knows how. Sarah packed her things quietly again, unaware that she had just become the talk of the entire range. People whispered to each other, pointing at her target board. The Snobby group, once the center of attention, now stood off to the side, looking smaller than they ever had. The truth was simple. Their expensive rifles, their fancy gloves, and their loud words couldn't match the strength of calm focus and real experience. And as Sarah tightened the strap of her rifle case, the late afternoon sun fell across her face, highlighting her steady eyes. She looked peaceful, like someone who had already fought many battles in life, and learned that silence and patience are stronger than any bullet. When she finally walked past the group, Mark tried to meet her eyes, maybe to say something and maybe to apologize, but she simply nodded politely and kept walking. She didn't need to say anything. Her shots had spoken for her. The range had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving. Every pair of eyes was fixed on one person, Sarah Collins, the quiet woman who had just humbled the loudest voices at the shooting range. But this was the moment everyone had been waiting for, her real turn. Not the test shots, not the warm-up, but the moment she would truly show what she was capable of. Sarah stood still for a few seconds, her back straight, her old rifle resting calmly in her hands. The afternoon sun fell gently across her face, lighting up her calm eyes. She wasn't proud, she wasn't nervous. She was simply present. Mark, Ryan, and Lance stood behind her, still trying to recover from their bruised egos. They whispered among themselves. Maybe she got lucky again, Ryan said under his breath. Mark crossed his arms. We'll see. No one's that consistent. Lance tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, let's see. Sarah didn't even glance their way. She focused on the target, the small circular board standing far down the lane, white and red, waiting in the still air. Tom, the old instructor, had stepped closer now. He watched her like a man who already knew what was about to happen. Sarah took one deep breath, then another. Her body loosened. Her shoulders relaxed. She positioned her feet perfectly, left foot slightly forward, right foot steady behind. It was a stance of confidence, but not the kind that shows off. It was quiet confidence and the kind that comes from experience. The crowd around her grew completely still. Even the usual chatter of the range faded. People who had been packing their gear stopped to watch. They could sense something different, something special about this moment. Sarah raised her rifle. The movement was slow and smooth like water flowing. Her cheek rested gently against the wooden stock. Her eyes narrowed, locking onto the bullseye like a hawk focusing on prey. The air was heavy with suspense. Everyone could hear her breathing. In, out, in, out. Her finger brushed the trigger lightly, testing it. Then with no hesitation, she squeezed. Bang! The rifle cracked through the silence. The echo rolled across the range like thunder. Smoke curled from the barrel as Sarah lowered her gun. Tom squinted toward the target. Then a faint smile crossed his face. Another perfect bullseye. A murmur spread through the crowd. People began whispering, some clapping quietly in disbelief. "No way," someone said. "That's impossible." Sarah didn't move. She just reloaded and prepared another shot. She didn't look proud or excited and just focused. Like it was normal. Mark's jaw tightened. "She's just showing off now," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual strength. Sarah steadied herself again. Her breathing slowed, her posture unshaken. Then she fired a second shot. Bang! The bullet hit the same spot. Perfectly center. The first hole almost swallowed the second. The crowd gasped. One man near the back even dropped his phone. Lance whispered, "That's not luck. That's precision." But Sarah wasn't done. She loaded one final bullet. This time the world seemed to hold its breath with her. The group of snobby shooters who had spent all morning laughing at her now stood frozen, eyes locked on her every move. Sarah took one long breath. Then calmly she pulled the trigger. Bang! The third bullet flew straight, slicing through the air like lightning. When it hit the target, the sound was sharp and final. When the dust settled, everyone stared in awe. All three bullets had hit the same hole. A triple bullseye. The range exploded in whispers, gasps, and stunned silence. People who had come just to practice were now recording on their phones, shaking their heads in disbelief. Mark dropped his rifle slightly. "What? How?" he stammered. Ryan stepped forward, his face pale.
"That's impossible."
"Nobody can shoot that clean." Tom finally broke the silence. "Nobody," he said softly, looking at them. "You've just met somebody who can." Sarah lowered her rifle, quietly unloading it with gentle hands. She didn't smile or boast. She simply looked down the range for a moment as if saying goodbye to something unseen. Then she turned to leave. As she walked past Mark and his friends, they stepped aside automatically. She nodded politely, her eyes kind but unreadable. Mark tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. All he could manage was, "You're incredible." Sarah paused for a moment and looked at him. "It's not about being incredible," she said softly. "It's about being patient." Then she continued walking, her footsteps quiet, her presence leaving behind a silence more powerful than any sound that day. Tom watched her go, a knowing look in his eyes. That woman, he said quietly to himself, wasn't here to compete. She was here to remember. No one understood what he meant, not yet. But deep down, everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare. A person whose strength came not from pride, but from peace. And as Sarah disappeared through the gate, the crowd remained still, staring at her target. 3 perfect shots, 1 hole, proof that sometimes true mastery doesn't shout, it whispers. For a long moment after that final shot, no one moved. The sound still echoed in everyone's ears as if the bullet had frozen time itself. The only thing anyone could hear was the soft clicking sound of Sarah unloading her rifle. The casing gently hitting the wooden bench. The group of snobby shooters, Mark, Ryan, and Lance, stood completely still. Their mouths were slightly open, their faces pale, their pride shattered. Just minutes ago they had laughed, joked, and bragged about being the best. Now they looked like students who had just met their first real teacher. No one dared to speak first. The silence was heavy but not empty. It carried something powerful, respect. Sarah didn't seem to notice the stares around her. She calmly placed her old rifle back in its worn leather case, carefully folded the strap and zipped it up. Every movement she made was slow, quiet, and sure. There was no rush, no showing off, just quiet precision. Tom, the old instructor, finally broke the stillness. He walked toward the target board with slow, deliberate steps. People followed him, curious and amazed. When he reached it, he leaned in and smiled softly. "All 3 shots," he said, turning toward the others. 1 hole, the crowd gasped. A few even clapped softly, unsure if they should. The whispers began again, this time full of admiration instead of mockery. She's unbelievable. That's not luck. That's mastery. Who is she? Back near the benches, Mark rubbed the back of his neck. His usual smirk was gone. His voice, when it finally came out, was small. Guess we misjudged her. Ryan looked down at his rifle and sighed. She made it look so easy. Lance nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the target. That wasn't just shooting, he said quietly. That was art. Tom returned, his face calm but his eyes bright. He looked at Sarah, who was standing quietly by her bench, her hands folded in front of her. Ma'am, he said gently, you ever think of competing again? Sarah looked up at him, her expression soft but distant. No, she said. Those days are behind me. Her voice was calm, steady, and humble. There was no pride in it, only peace. Tom nodded knowingly. He'd seen that look before, the look of someone who had already proven herself long ago and no longer needed to. The crowd around her began to disperse, but they didn't stop glancing her way. She had become the story everyone would tell for weeks, the woman who silenced the range with one perfect shot. Sarah picked up her bag and started walking toward the exit. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, the sun glinting off her old rifle case. The air around her seemed lighter now, calmer. When she passed Mark and his friends, they stepped aside respectfully. Mark hesitated, then said softly, Ma'am, I'm sorry. We shouldn't have laughed. Sarah stopped for a moment. She turned to him with a faint smile that didn't feel proud or bitter, just kind. That's all right, she said. Sometimes it takes silence to teach respect. Then she walked away, her steps steady and quiet. For a while, no one said anything. The wind picked up again, rustling through the trees. The sound of the leaves filled the space where laughter used to be. Tom looked at her retreating figure and murmured to himself, calm under pressure, sharp as ever. Some people never lose it. Mark stared downrange at the target once more. He had spent years calling himself a professional, but in a single afternoon, one simple woman had taught him more about focus and humility than all his practice ever had. As Sarah disappeared beyond the gate, the echo of her shot seemed to linger, not as a sound, but as a memory. The kind that stays with you, quietly reminding you that real strength never needs to prove itself. From that day on, people at the range talked about her with a kind of quiet awe. They didn't know her full story, but they didn't need to. She had shown them something words could never teach, that sometimes the most powerful moments in life are born not from noise but from silence, and so the legend of the calm woman with the old rifle lived on, a reminder to never judge, never mock, and never underestimate the quiet ones. The next morning, the shooting range was quieter than usual. The echo of yesterday's event still lingered like a ghost. People whispered about it, about the calm woman with the old rifle who had walked in alone, been mocked by the snobby shooters, and walked out leaving everyone speechless. Word had spread fast. By noon, almost everyone who loved shooting in that small town had heard the story. Some called her the silent sharpshooter. Others simply referred to her as the woman with the one perfect shot. But no one really knew who she was. Tom, the instructor, couldn't stop thinking about her. All night her composure replayed in his mind, the way she had breathed, aimed, and fired with such control. He had seen that kind of skill before, but only in very specific people. Military, maybe, law enforcement. Someone trained at the highest level. The next day, as he sat at his desk in the small range office, he looked through old membership records, flipping through yellowed pages and faded files. Then suddenly a name caught his eye. Sarah Collins, registered member 2008. He paused. 2008? That was over 15 years ago. He pulled out the file. Inside was a faded photo. A younger Sarah wearing a military uniform holding a precision rifle. His eyes widened. It all made sense now. Tom leaned back in his chair, the realization washing over him. She wasn't just an ordinary woman. She had been one of the top snipers in the National Armed Forces. A decorated markswoman who had once represented her unit in international competitions. Her records were impressive. Dozens of awards, near-perfect accuracy scores. And one headline from an old newspaper clipping inside the folder. Captain Sarah Collins wins National Shooting Championship. Marks perfect record. Tom let out a slow whistle. I knew it, he muttered. That calm. That control. You don't forget that. Later that afternoon, Mark, Ryan, and Lance returned to the range, quieter and more humble than before. They didn't brag. They didn't laugh. They just wanted to practice. Tom walked over to them, holding the old file. "You boys remember the woman from yesterday?" he asked. Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Hard to forget someone like that." Tom handed him the file. "You wanted to know who she is? Read this." Mark opened it, and as his eyes scanned the first few lines, his expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. "She was a sniper?" he whispered. Ryan leaned over his shoulder. "Captain Sarah Collins. Military champion. Served 8 years. Honorable discharge." His voice trailed off. Lance looked stunned. "We mocked a national-level sniper?" Tom nodded. "You mocked a legend," he said quietly. "But she didn't come here to prove anything. She came here to remember who she was." The three of them stood there speechless. For the first time they understood why she had carried that old rifle, why she hadn't needed to speak, why every shot she took had been flawless. She wasn't showing off. She was simply revisiting an old part of herself, a part built from discipline, not pride. Mark closed the file slowly and sighed. "We laughed at her like idiots," he said. "She could have put any of us to shame. And she didn't even have to try." Tom smiled softly. "That's the thing about true professionals," he said. "They don't need to talk about what they've done. Their actions speak for them." From that day on, everything changed at the range. The laughter that used to come at others' expense was gone. The snobby shooters practiced quietly now, with focus and respect. And pinned to the wall behind Tom's desk was a copy of Sarah's old photo, a silent reminder of humility, precision, and grace. Sometimes Sarah would visit again, never announced, never loud. She would quietly take her lane, shoot a few rounds, then leave before anyone could make a fuss. But whenever she was there, the whole range seemed to stand a little taller, shoot a little straighter, and speak a little softer. To the regulars, she had become more than a memory. She was a living lesson. A reminder that greatness doesn't need attention, it just needs purpose. And though Sarah never mentioned her past, everyone who had seen her that day carried her story with them. The day a group of proud shooters met a humble legend, and learned that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who's already conquered the loudest battles. Weeks passed, but people at the shooting range still talked about that one afternoon. The story spread far beyond the small town, about the quiet woman with the old rifle who silenced a crowd not with anger, but with precision, grace, and calm strength. Sarah Collins never returned for attention. She came sometimes quietly, always at odd hours when the range was nearly empty. She'd take her usual lane at the far end, fire a few rounds, then pack up and leave without a word. Those who happened to see her never disturbed her. They just watched in awe, grateful for the rare sight. But the biggest change wasn't in Sarah. It was in the people she left behind. Mark, Ryan, and Lance, the snobby shooters, were different now. The swagger was gone. So was the loud laughter and the arrogance. They still practiced, but there was humility in the way they handled their weapons now. They cleaned their rifles with more respect. They talked less and listened more. Mark, who once loved showing off, now often told new shooters, "Don't underestimate anyone. Skill doesn't wear a label." Ryan began helping beginners with positioning and aim, remembering how cruel he had once been to Sarah. And Lance? He had hung a small picture of her bullseye on his locker, a reminder that silence could sometimes speak louder than any shot. One Saturday, a young girl came to the range, nervous and shy. She carried a small borrowed rifle and trembled as she tried to set it up. The men noticed her from across the room. Mark walked over, remembering that day all too well. "Need a hand?" he asked gently. The girl looked up, surprised. "You won't laugh at me?" she asked. He smiled. "Not a chance." That moment was proof Sarah's calmness had done something powerful. It had changed hearts. Her quiet strength had left a mark that words could never achieve. Tom, the old instructor, often thought about it when he locked up the range at night. Sometimes he'd glance at Sarah's old picture on the wall, the one from her army days, and whisper, "You did more in one afternoon than I've done in 20 years. Sarah never knew about the change she inspired. To her, it was just another day. She had lived her life with discipline and peace, and that's what she brought with her wherever she went. But to those men and to everyone who had witnessed that afternoon, she became a symbol of something bigger. That true power doesn't need to shout. True confidence doesn't need to prove itself. And real respect is earned, not demanded. As time went on, new shooters joined, old ones left, but the story stayed. It became almost a legend. Every time someone at the range mocked a beginner, someone else would stop them and say, "Careful. Remember the woman with the one perfect shot." And every time they said it, people would fall silent for a moment, imagining her calm face, her steady hands, and the quiet sound of that single shot that had changed everything. Sarah's name might have faded from memory for some, but her lesson lived on, carried quietly in the minds of those who had once laughed, and now understood, because in a world full of noise and pride, one woman with an old rifle had proven something eternal. Respect is earned not through words, but through grace, focus, and silence that speaks louder than thunder. And long after her footsteps faded from that gravel path, the echo of her calm spirit remained, reminding everyone that the strongest people are often the quietest ones.